Masechet Zevaḥim, Daf Kof Zayin. The Mishnah taught a machloket between Rabbi Yosef HaGalili and Tana Kama. Rabbi Yosef HaGalili said that if one did shechita inside and served it outside, he is liable. That they agree on. However, if someone took a consecrated animal and slaughtered it outside, then that's it. It's already pasul. And therefore, if he also burns it outside, he will be patur for the burning and only liable to one count of karet for slaughtering it outside. That was the opinion of Rabbi Yosef HaGalili, who's more lenient in that sense. However, the Tana Kama said, no, either way, one is liable. So therefore, even if one did the shechita outside and also burnt it outside, he is liable twice for the shechita and also for burning it outside. So we're going to pick up on that opinion of Tana Kama. And we're going to ask, Ashkechan muktere penim she'ayla nachutz, muktere chutz she'ayla nachutz minayin. On the previous daf, we quoted a source for muktere penim. That means something that is worthy of burning on the inside. Well, meaning in the courtyard. Well, what's fit to be burnt in the courtyard? Something that you did shechita properly in the courtyard. So from now on, we're going to translate muktere penim as an offering that was slaughtered inside the courtyard. Technically, though, it means something that is fit to be burnt in the courtyard because it was slaughtered in the courtyard. Okay, so far we saw a source from Vayikra 17, Pesukim 8 and 9. We saw that if one burns a sacrifice that was slaughtered inside, and then you burned it, he'elan nachutz, and you burned it outside, then one is liable to karet. That's the Pesukim from 17, 8 and 9. However, we still don't have a source for muktere chutz, something that is fit only to be burnt outside. That is a reference to something that a sacrificial animal that you did shechita on it outside. Once you do shechita outside, it's no longer fit to be brought as a korban inside. You have to burn it outside. You have to destroy it. However, if instead of destroying it, burning it on a pile of ashes because now it's invalid, instead you offer it as a sacrifice outside, then you're liable again to another karet. So one karet for shechita outside, and another karet for burning it outside. That is Tana Kama says you're liable twice, but we don't have a source yet for that because, let's go back to the Pesukim, 8 and 9, it says, that ya'aleh means burning, and you don't burn it in ohel moed. So far we only know this is talking about a valid korban that you did shechita inside, and then you burn it outside. Now look at this word va'alehem tomar, which literally means, and also go and tell Bnei Israel this law. Hashem is telling Moshe. Okay, so let's see the answer. Amar Rav Kahana, Amar Kera, va'alehem tomar, al hasimuchin tomar. Rav Kahana is reading the aleph as if it's an ayin, and saying va'alehem, and upon them, upon what came before, also add this, simuchin, that which is found in the adjacent passage. Well, the Pesukim beforehand, we're talking about someone who slaughters a sacrifice outside of the courtyard. And so now we're saying, we just mentioned before this pasuk, slaughtering a korban outside of the courtyard, alehem. Upon that, we're going to add now another law. If you take that very korban and you burn it outside the courtyard, you also will be liable. That's how you know. Matkif la Rava, mi ketiv va'alehem ketib. Rava says you can't misspell a word. It says in ayin. It doesn't say in ayin, it says in aleph. You can't say upon that, but rather to them, to Bnei Israel. Go and say these words. So Rava does not accept the derasha of Rav Kahana. Ela kedatana deber b'Yishmael va'alehem tomar le'arev parshiot. Rather, he gives a different derivation from the school of Rabbi Ishmael that says the vav of va alehem, that vav is connecting the two paragraphs, and so it's the same idea. but not from the word alehem, but rather from the vav. And just like beforehand, we had a law that someone who slaughters a sacrificial animal outside the courtyard is chayav karet, and then a vav comes to say, and if you would take that very animal that you slaughtered outside and also burn it outside, you'd be liable for another violation of karet. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Atya Hava'a, Ma lahalan muktere chutz, Afkan muktere chutz. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, I will learn it from a gezer hashava. It says in 17.4 and in 17.9. Here in 17.9 it says, Lo yevienu. He doesn't bring it to Ohel Moed. And in 17.4, when it was talking about the shechita, it said, Petach Moed lo hevi'o. And from that gezer hashava, we can learn that just like that pasuk was talking about something slaughtered outside, so too, this pasuk in 9, that's talking about the burning, is talking about burning a sacrifice that was slaughtered outside. So that's yet another derivation. Matkif lara bevai haditnan sheloshim veshesh karetot batorah telatin veshabavyan dika hama'ale vehama'ale. Rabbevai is going to object to all of these derivations, in fact to the very law itself, because in the Mishnah in Masechet Keretot it says there are 36 different violations for which one gets karet, and this is a comprehensive list of all 36. And our law is not among them. It does not mention if you slaughter something outside. That's one of them, if you slaughter a korban outside. But it doesn't say if you slaughter outside and you burn it outside, then that's another one. And if you're going to count that, then it shouldn't be 36, it should be 37. But it doesn't say the 37th one, it's only 36. So this is indeed a challenge. And perhaps that Mishnah would agree with Rabbi Yosef Galili, who doesn't think that there's a liability here. Anyway, we do not answer that question. Now that while we're at it, finding derivations, we're going to find the derivation for a law of a Mishnah coming up that talks about sprinkling of the blood. So far, we covered slaughter of a sacrifice outside and burning of the animal outside. But how about sprinkling the blood of a sacrificial animal outside? There one is also liable. How do you know? Nafka midetanya dam yechashev lerabot hazorek Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Ishmael learns it from 17:4. We just had this pasuk that says, if someone does this, dam yechashev, will consider blood upon him. Sounds like, guilt of blood. But why is used dam? To say that he's guilty. So dam is referring to sprinkling of the blood. That's Rabbi Ishmael's derivation. Rabbi Akiva Omer, O Zebach lerabot et hazorek. He learns it from this pasuk in 8 that says, if someone brings Ya'aleh Olah or Zabach el Petach ol Moed. So just say Olah or just say Zabach. Or just say Olah, you could say Olah ve'Zabach. What's this word O coming to teach? This word O is coming to teach yet another act, not only or burning this animal, but also sprinkling of the blood. So now Rabbi Ishmael, since he learns it from Dam Yachasheb, what does he do with this word O? So Rabbi Ishmael, kedarko, he says we need it for the context, to divide between the two cases. Don't think that you need, in order to get karet, you have to offer a korban olah. Korban zevach generally means a shelamim. Don't think you have to offer a korban olah outside of the courtyard and also a shelamim outside. Then you get karet. You might think that if it said olah vazavach. So you need o to separate, to say anyone, whether it's a korban olah or a korban shelamim, either one alone. If you offer it outside of the courtyard, then one would get karet. Lechalek. Rabbi Akiva lechalek minaleh. Rabbi Akiva, where is he going to learn that you should divide and you're liable to each case by itself, since he used o for the previous law? Nafkale me lo yebi'ennu. He learns it from this word, which is in singular. El petach moed lo yebi'ennu. He doesn't bring it. It is singular, meaning only one animal. So I know it's even if one offers just one sacrifice outside, one is liable. Notice the next words, la sot oto la Hashem. That's going to be important coming up next. Ve'Rabbi Ishmael, hahu miba'eleh al hashalem uchayav ve'eno chayav al hehaser. Now, what is Rabbi Ishmael? What is he going to do with this word yevi'enu, that he offered it? Oh, this is to teach that he is liable only if he burns the entire animal outside of the courtyard. But let's say he burns only a piece of the animal outside the courtyard, he is not liable to karet. Eno chayav al hechaser. Rabbi Akiva, where is Rabbi Akiva going to learn this rule that he is liable if he only if he burns the whole thing, but not if he burns just a piece of the animal? Nafkale me la'asot oto. La'asot oto, to sacrifice it, means the whole thing and not a part of it. V'Rabbi Ishmael, chad muktere penim shechasru ve'elu bachutz, v'chad muktere chutz shechasru ve'elu bachutz. Rabbi Ishmael says, actually, I need two pisukim to derive this law to cover two cases. One is if it was slaughtered inside and then offered outside, where that's a pretty stringent law because it was offered inside. So technically it's a valid korban, and now you're burning it outside, so this is not good. And yet, if you burn only part of it, you're not liable to karet. That's one case. And you need also the other one to teach me the case where if I slaughtered it outside and then also offered it outside, there also I'm only liable if I burn the whole thing, but if I burn only part of it, I'm not liable. So that's why he needs two pisukim. So that's what he does with la'asot oto. V'hatanya, Rabbi Ishmael omer, yachol muktere penim shechasru ve'elu bachutz chayav, tamud omar la'asot oto, al hashalem chayav ve'no chayav al hechaser. And in fact, we have a beraita that supports that Rabbi Ishmael covers both of these cases. As it says, you might think that if you slaughtered it inside and then you offer it out, part of it outside, you would be liable because that's a more stringent case, because since you slaughtered inside, it's a valid korban. Maybe you'll be liable even for burning part of it outside. Therefore, the pasuk says la'asot oto. You see that he uses these extra words to teach me that one is liable only oto if you burn the whole animal, but if you only burn part of the animal, he is not liable to karet. Rabbi Akiva. Now, Rabbi Akiva, where is he going to derive this that covers both cases? The answer is he doesn't agree with that law. He thinks that if it was slaughtered inside and then you only burned part of it outside, you are still liable to karet. Rabbi Akiva would agree in a case where it was slaughtered outside and burnt outside, that if you only did part of it, you're not liable, because that's a more lenient case. Once you slaughter it outside, already that lowers it's not valid anymore. So in addition, you only did part of it, okay, then you're not liable. So Rabbi Akiva doesn't agree with half of this law, and therefore he doesn't need another pasuk. He can use la'asot oto for a different purpose. Rabbi Akiva, hi dam yechashev mai abid le. Now Rabbi Akiva, what is he going to do with dam yechashev? That's what Rabbi Ishmael used to learn the original law that we started with, that sprinkling outside of the Mikdash is liable. That Rabbi Ishmael used it for that. Rabbi Akiva has learned it from Aw. So what's he going to do with dam yechashev? Ledabot shechita ta'of, to include if you do shechita on a bird, a sacrificial bird, you do shechita outside of the Mikdash. So far we only learned for an animal. How about for an off? Also, one is liable. This is interesting because a bird inside, the proper way to do it is melika. Nevertheless, outside, one is liable if you do shechita of a sacrificial bird outside. Liable to karet. Rabbi Ishmael, nafkale me'o asher yishchat. Rabbi Ishmael will learn this from 17.3. Let's go back to there to see that. Ish mi Beit Yisrael asher yishchat shoro chesed o ez machane o asher yishchat michus machane. This is an extra phrase here. You already talked about the animals. O means something else. Yishchat, something else. That's referring to a bird. What is Rabbi Akiva going to do with that phrase, or asher yishchat? Is to teach you that your one is liable for slaughtering a bird outside of the temple courtyard, but if he does milika outside of the temple courtyard, he is not liable, which is actually quite interesting, because that would be the proper way to kill a bird inside, but it's not proper outside. Outside, if it was a non-sacrificial bird, and you wanted to slaughter it, you have to do shechita and not melika. So therefore, since this is outside, in a way we recognize the shechita as being a significant act for which one is liable if you do it outside. Whereas milika, since it's not considered a legally significant act outside, therefore one is not liable, although it's a sacrificial animal. Okay, it's a sacrificial bird. That's Rabbi Akiva. But Rabbi Ishmael, nafkale me zeh hadavar. Rabbi Ishmael, doesn't he agree with this? He does, and he learns it from zeh hadavar in Pasuk 2, where it says zeh hadavar, which is a limiting phrase, this and only this, meaning only for shechita, even for a bird, one is liable if you do shechita on a bird outside the temple courtyard. You're not liable if you do milika on a sacrificial bird outside. Tanya, asher yishchat, en li ela shochet behema, shachat of minalan, Talmud omar, o asher yishchat, yachol af hamolek, vedin hu, ma shechita de'en derech hechsher habifnim, hayav, melika shederech hechsher habifnim, en odin shu chayav, Talmud omar, zeh hadavar. We have a braita that backs up what we just said about Rabbi Ishmael for both of these derivations. When it says asher yishchat, so I only know that if you do shechita of a behema, that outside, then you're liable to karet. What if you do shechita on a bird? That's why it says, oh, asher yishchat. Good, that's what we said. Now, how about if you do milika on a bird? Would you be liable? Now, based on the Kal Vachomer, you would say yes. If regarding shechita, where that's not the proper way to kill a bird inside the temple courtyard, and yet when you do it outside, you're liable, then if you do milika outside, where that is the proper way to kill it when you're inside, so all the more so, you would think you should be liable if you do milika outside of the temple courtyard to a sacrificial bird. So based on the Kal Vachomer, you would say yes. That's why it says, Talmud omar zeh hadavar. That's why it says this, and only this. That is a limiting word. Rabbi Akiva, what are you going to do with the phrase zeh hadavar? Amar lach, hahumi ba'eleh ligezerah shava. He uses it for a gezerah shava. It says the word zeh hadavar also regarding nidarim. And we make a gezerah shava between the two. And one of the things that we learn from that gezerah shava is that just like for when it comes to a neder, a vow, you can annul the vow. You go to the sages and you can annul the vow. So too, if you consecrate an animal with a vow, then you can annul it, which is very good because that means if something goes wrong, you can always annul the vow, and then retroactively it was never consecrated to begin with. And so even if you did slaughter it outside, you're liable to karet, annul the vow. It was never a consecrated animal, and now that will undo the karet. We also learn the other way from this that you don't need the greatest leaders of the generation, but even three common people can listen to a vow and be able to annul it. והדתנן, הקומץ והמקבל דמים בחוץ פטור מנלן. And now we go on to another Mishnah that says if someone does kimitza of flour or receives blood of an animal sacrifice outside of the temple courtyard, then he is not liable to karet. And now we ask us for a derivation of that. How do you know? Now, before we look for a derivation, we wonder, why do we need one? Why would you think one would be liable that you need a proof that it's not liable? The general rule is everything is permitted unless there's some source that say it's prohibited. There are some people that like to take the other way and say everything's prohibited unless there's a source that's permitted. But that's not the correct approach. And you see right here, why would you even think that it would be prohibited, that you have to say, oh, we need a source? Do you ask for every act that one could possibly do? Do you ask for a source? How do you know this is permitted? How do you know that's permitted? So therefore, if there's no source that says doing kimitza and doing Kabbalah outside is prohibited, then we just should assume that it is permitted. So now we're going to attempt a proof that in fact is prohibited to show why we might need a pasuk to say that's permitted. So let's learn it from shechita. In other words, just like shechita is one of the activities you do with a korban, and if you do shechita outside, it's liable to karet. So this is comparable. Let's focus on Kabbalah. Same thing would be for kimitza. Kimitza and Kabbalah are equivalent. Kimitza is for mincha offering, Kabbalah is for an animal sacrifice. But otherwise, they're basically equivalent activities. So just like shechita is an act you do on a korban, and that's liable. So why don't we learn from there as a mematzinu? You find it there, so it should make sense. So it should be the same. No, you would not derive it from there, because shechita has a stringency that shechita will, if you do shechita, in having in mind people that cannot eat a korban pesach, then you invalidate the korban pesach. It's a special law regarding korban pesach that you have to have in mind that you're doing shechita for the group of people that are eating it. And if you have in mind, I'm doing this shechita for a group of people that can't swallow food. They're elderly, they're sick, and they can't eat solids. Well, they can't possibly eat a kezait of the korban pesach. Then the korban pesach is pasul. Whereas if you do Kabbalah, having in mind people who can't eat it, it doesn't nullify the Kabbalah. So this is only a law of shechita. Since shechita has that stringency, maybe that's why the one is liable to karet. You can't learn from shechita to Kabbalah. Tetem zerika. Okay, why not learn it from zerika? We already learned that if one sprinkles blood outside of Beit Mikdash, one is liable. That's what we derived that earlier. And so, just like zirika, that's one of the services you do with a korban, and one is liable to karet, so to Kabbalah. No, ma zirika sheken zar hayav aleha mita. When it comes to zirika, if a non-kohen sprinkles the blood, then he would be liable to the death penalty bidei shamayim. But that is not true for Kabbalah. If a non-kohen does Kabbalah, he's not hayav aleha mita. So zirika has a stringency that does not generally apply to Kabbalah if a zar does it, and therefore you cannot learn the law of zirika outside the temple to the law of Kabbalah outside the temple. Tetemi benaya. Okay, how about we put the two together? If we learn from the common denominator between shechita and zirika, they have a common denominator that if you do it outside the courtyard, one is liable to karet. So too Kabbalah should be the same thing. And the individual stringencies of one do not apply to the other. So can't we learn it from both? Hold on. If you're going to follow this methodology and learn from two services to any one other, well, in that case, the Torah would not have to have extra language to teach you zirika. That zirika that we learned above from Rabbi Akiva from the word o, from Rabbi Ishmael, learned it from dam yechashev. Either way, you would not need a pasuk to tell you that zirika is chayav karet, because we would be able to learn it from a combination of two other activities. How so? We would try to first learn zirika from shechita. However, we would reject that because shechita, if you do it having in mind people that cannot eat it, then it's invalid. So you can't learn from shechita to zirika. Or how about learn it from burning the korban outside of the temple courtyard? And therefore, also zirika is since hala'ah is liable to karet, so to zirika. Now you'd reject that. Ma'leha hala'ah sheken yeshna b'mincha, but hala'ah bringing it, burning something on the mizbeach, that you do for korban, and you also do it for korban mincha. Whereas zirika, sprinkling blood on the altar, you don't have for korban mincha. So ha'ala'ah has a stringency in that it applies to korban mincha, and zirika does not apply to korban mincha. So therefore, you cannot learn from ha'ala'ah to zirika. Oh, v'tetemi benaya. Okay, but we can combine shechita and ha'ala'ah, and the common denominator is both of them. One is liable karet for doing it outside the courtyard, so too zirika, outside the temple courtyard. So since we could learn it from the common denominator between shechita and hala'ah, why do we have a pasuk that tells us that zirika outside the courtyard is liable to karet, a derivation from pasuk? That's why we have it, to teach you that we will not use this methodology of learning from a common denominator. In other words, from the fact that you could learn zirika from the two others, And yet the Torah goes out of its way to say dam yechashev, or the word o, to teach me that zedikah is liable. That's telling you, don't learn it from a common denominator. That methodology is no good, invalid. And since now we know that methodology is invalid for zedikah, it's also going to be invalid for Kabbalah, and therefore, in fact, there is no source to even think that Kabbalah would or kemitzah would be prohibited, and therefore we don't need any source to tell me that is permitted. Amar Rabbi Abhu, shachat vezarak l'divrei Rabbi Ishmael chayav achat, l'divrei Rabbi Akiva chayav shetayim. Rabbi Abhu has an interesting observation. If one did shechita and zedikah within one lapse of forgetfulness, how many korban hatats would he have to bring? According to the Ishmael, only one. Why? Shechita is said explicitly in the first half of the paragraph in Vayikra 17. And zedikah, remember, the Ishmael learned from dam yechashev, which is said in Pasuk 4, which is in the context of shechita. So since we derive zedikah from the context of shechita, it's considered a subcategory of shechita. And if you do two acts that are the same type within the same category within one period of forgetfulness, then you're only liable to one korban chatat. However, according to the Rabbi Akiva, he learns zedikah from 17:8, was from the word o, which is in the context of burning the sacrifice outside. That's a different context. So according to Rabbi Akiva, zedikah is a subcategory of burning and a separate category from shechita. Therefore, if he did shechita and zedikah, shechita is liable for one korban chatat, and zedikah, that's a subcategory of burning the korban, and therefore it's a separate category, so it's liable to two korban chatats. Abaye Amar, afilu divrei Rabbi Akiva eno chayav ela achat. Abaye disagrees with Rabbi Abu and says, no, even according to Rabbi Akiva, he would be liable only to one korban chatat. Why? Damar kera sham ta'aseh hakatub asa nechulan avodah achat. Since the pasuk in Sefer Devarim, we mentioned this pasuk yesterday, we had hekesh of sham and sham. Since it says sham, there you will perform the sacrifice, and performing the sacrifice includes shechita and zedikah. So that shows that all of the activities that you would do with the sacrifice are considered one. And therefore, if you do shechita and zedikah of a sacrifice outside of the courtyard, that within one lapse of forgetfulness, that's all considered one general act, and therefore liable only to one korban chatat, even though Rabbi Akiva derives them from different places. Zarak ve'ela l'divrei Ishmael chayav shetayim. L'divrei Rabbi Akiva eno chayav ela achat. And now we're going to flip everything around, because we're going to talk about doing zedikah and burning. Within one lapse, one sprinkled the blood and burnt the animal within one lapse of forgetfulness. According to the Ishmael, you're liable to two. Why? Because he learned zedikah again from the beginning of the paragraph, which is talking about shechita. And he'ela is from the end of the paragraph, and so therefore zedikah is a subcategory of shechita, and ha'ala'ah is different, and therefore these are two different categories, and one is liable to two korban chatats. Whereas according to Rabbi Akiva, he learned zedikah from the same pasuk, which is in the context of burning, ha'ala'ah. Therefore zedikah is a subcategory of ha'ala'ah. Two acts within the same category, within one lapse of awareness, you're liable only to one korban chatat. And here again, Abaye Amar, afilu divrei Rabbi Akiva chayav shetayim lahachi palginhu kera sham ta'aleh ve'sham ta'aseh. Abaye says no. Even according to Rabbi Akiva, he would be liable to two counts in this case, because of that, again, that same pasuk in Sefer Devarim that says sham twice, and one sham is for ta'aleh, is for the burning, and the other sham is for ta'aseh. Ta'aseh will include the other acts that you do besides the burning, of the doing shechita and kabbalah and zedikah. So all those are part of the ta'aseh. And so even according to Rabbi Akiva, even though he learns zedikah from the context of ha'alah, it doesn't matter where you learn it from. The pasuk in Devarim tells you that zedikah is part of ta'aseh and ha'alah is part of ta'aleh. And so these are two separate categories, and one is liable twice. Shachat ve'zarak ve'ela divrei kol chayav shetayim. If one did three things outside of the temple courtyard, shechita, and also zirika, and also hala'ah, and he did all these three things outside, everybody would agree that he's liable to two. Because no matter what, one is liable to shechita, that's one, and hala'ah is going to be another. Everybody agrees that shechita and hala'ah are two separate categories. The machloket is, will zirika be included within shachat or included within hala'ah? Doesn't matter. Either way, you're already bringing two for shachat and hala'ah, and everybody agrees that zarak is not a separate category. Tenor banan ba machane yachol hashochet ola badarom yeheh chayab Talmud omar el mechusa machane. Pasuk in 17:3. Let's go back and look at it. Ish mi Beit Yisrael asher yishchat shor o keseb o ez ba machane. So the first half of the pasuk says you're not allowed to slaughter any of these things in the encampment. So the encampment is a certain area that's outside of the courtyard, and that's not allowed. Or if you do it outside the encampment, means even farther out. So both of these things are prohibited. The question is, why does the pasuk have to say both machaneh and mechutza machaneh? Like, wouldn't one be sufficient? What exactly is it talking about? So the machaneh. Now, you might think that if someone would slaughter a kodesh kodashim, let's say korban olah, has to be slaughtered in the northern part of the courtyard. Now, what if you slaughter in the south? Maybe you'll say that's outside of the designated area, and so maybe one would be liable to karet for doing it in the south and it's supposed to be in the north. Therefore, it says el michutz lamachaneh. The end of the pasuk says totally outside. It has to be totally outside to be liable to karet. Now, if you take a korban olah and you do it in the south, it may be invalid. That's true, but you're not going to be liable to karet since it says totally outside el michutz lamachaneh. Okay, if you only had el chutz lamachaneh, you might think maybe one is liable to karet only if you do a shechita totally outside all three camps. That's the equivalent of doing it outside of Jerusalem. But maybe if you did it inside of Jerusalem, but outside of the courtyard, maybe you wouldn't be liable to karet. How do you know even within the middle camp that one would be liable? That's why it's to say ba machaneh, even in the closer, not only michutz machaneh, but even within the encampment. So that means anywhere outside of the courtyard, even on the Temple Mount or in Jerusalem, also one would be liable. Yachol hashochet ola bedarom yeheh chayav Talmud omar o el mechutz lamachaneh. Now, if you have just b'machaneh, then you might think, as we said before, that if you do shechita of a kodesh kodashim in the south, maybe one would be liable. That's why it says Talmud omar o el mechutz lamachaneh, that it would have to be outside the machaneh, so that one is only liable if it's outside of the Temple Mount. Okay, so from the combination of machaneh and chutz machaneh, we learn that it's only in between. If you are only a little bit off for kodesh kodashim, you're supposed to be in the north. If you move to the south, but you're still within the temple courtyard, you don't get karet. However, if it's outside of that, then there would be karet, and so that's why you have el mechutz lamachaneh to say you can go a little bit out, but b'machaneh to teach me that if you do shechita anywhere in Jerusalem or outside of Jerusalem, you do get karet. מה חוץ למחנה מיוחד שאין ראוי לשחיטת קודשים ולשחיטת כל זבח יעשה דרום שאף על פי שאין ראוי לשחיטת קודשי קודשים ראוי לשחיטת קודשים קלים. So how do you know to distinguish that a kodesh kodashim would still not be karet in the south? As follows. Just like chutz machaneh is special, what's different about being outside? Because chutz machaneh is not a proper place to do shechita for anything, not for kodashim and shechitat kol zebach. There's no such thing as doing any korban outside of the encampment completely. So even for kodashim kalim, it can't be outside. So that excludes darom. Shafapi, even though you cannot do kodesh kodashim in the south, you can do shechita of kadashim kalim in the south. You could slaughter kadashim kalim anywhere in the courtyard. So therefore, that's the point. Since the courtyard is an area where you could do shechita for kodashim kalim, therefore, if you do shechita of kodesh kodashim somewhere on the courtyard, although not in the right place in the south, So still you would not get karet because it's a place where you could sacrifice something. But if you sacrifice something outside of the courtyard where you're not allowed to sacrifice anything there, then that's considered outside the camp, and one would be liable to karet. Amar Ula, hashochet al gago shel hechal hayav, hoil ve'en ra'ui l'shchitat kol zebach. Ula says, if one does a slaughter on the roof of the sanctuary, now technically it's inside the courtyard, but it's not on the floor of the courtyard, it's on the roof. So that's considered outside, one would be liable, because that's not a proper place for any korban. מתקיף לערבה, אם כן נכתוב קרא, מחוץ למחנה, ולבאה אל פתח אוהל מועד. אל פתח אוהל מועד למלי, לאו למיעוטי גגו. Rava rejects Ula's proof. He says, if so, that the on the roof is not good, then the pasuk could just say, that you're liable if you do it outside the encampment. And you don't need to tell me that you have to bring it to the entrance of Ohl Moed. Why does it have to say only to the entrance of Ohl Moed? Is it not to exclude on the roof? Meaning to exclude the roof from the prohibition. It's saying El Petoch Al Moed as long as it's anywhere near, so maybe the roof would be excluded from the liability and one would not be liable to karet if one did shechita on the roof. ולרבה, אם כן נכתוב אל פתח אוהל מועד במחנה, מחוץ למחנה, למלי, לאו לתויה גגו. Now we challenge Rava, if so, if this is true, that slaughtering on the roof of the hechal one is not liable, well then you know what? The pasuk could have just written El Petoch Al Moed. From that I would learn that it has to be within the courtyard and can't be outside, just from that phrase. And then the pasuk wouldn't have to say anything about Bamachaneh and Michus LaMachaneh that we derived everything from above. Just have El Petach Moed. Isn't that simpler? Why do I need that? So then, wouldn't that be to come to include that a roof? Once you say Bamachaneh, so that means that the roof also is going to be prohibited. So either way, you're going to have to include the roof as being prohibited. Rav Mari, no, le'atuye kula bifnim v'savara b'chutz. Leave the machaneh and mechus machaneh as we derived it above. That one is liable outside the courtyard, but inside the courtyard, even the south, it's okay. Leave that. And what will Rava do with the words el petach ohl moed? That will come to include if the animal, the body of the animal is in the courtyard, but its neck is outside the courtyard. It's right in the gateway between them, and one does shechita. So when it says El Petach Ohl Moed, even at the entrance, literally, right on the threshold of the entrance, one would be liable for doing shechita because the head is outside. We ask about that. Savara b'chutz b'shita. Amai kapid rachamana shechita u'shchita b'chusi. No, if the neck is outside, obviously the person would be liable karet for doing shechita. What does Hashem care about? He's looking at the shechita. So the neck is outside. The shechita is happening outside. So therefore, obviously, you don't need a pasuk to teach me that. Rather, the other way around, if the body of the animal is outside, but the neck is sticking in, there you would think logically that since the neck is inside, that means the act of shechita is happening in the courtyard. So it should be okay. That's why it says, El Petach Ohl Moed, to teach me that law, that even if the neck is inside but the body is outside, one would still be liable to karet. Itmar hama'ale bazman hazeh. Rabbi Yochanan amar chayav, Resh Lakish amar patur. Now, a very important machloket, if someone would go and offer a sacrifice outside of the courtyard nowadays, after the destruction of the Beit Mikdash. Rabbi Yochanan says, he would be liable. Resh Lakish says, no, not liable nowadays, only in the time of the Beit HaMikdash. Rabbi Yochanan amar chayav kedusha rishona kiddusha le'sha'ata vekiddusha le'atid labo. Resh Lakish amar patur kedusha rishona kiddusha le'sha'ata ve'lo kiddusha le'atid labo. Rabbi Yochanan says he would be liable because the consecration of the Mikdash that happened at first was for its time and for the future. Even though the Beit HaMikdash, when it was consecrated, it was okay. Now this place is consecrated. That's true for its time while the Beit HaMikdash was there. But when they consecrated it, it was permanent. Had a permanent status, and therefore forevermore. any korban that's offered outside of the courtyard is going to be liable to karet. Now, does that mean you can offer it inside where the place is? We'll get to that in a minute. Rish Lakish says he's not liable. Why? Because the sanctification of the Mikdash that happened when they were constructing the Beit Mikdash was only for its time, temporary, and not for future times. Therefore, in future times, if one does go and offer a sacrifice outside, it will be the same as doing so in the time of Bamot, when it was permitted to do so, and therefore there is no liability. It seems that the machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, the Amoraim, parallels the machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, the Tanaim. Titnan, Amar Rabbi Eliezer, kishayu bonin bahechal, hayu osin kelaim bahechal, kelaim ba'azarot. Ela shebahechal bonin mibachutz, ba'azara bonin mibifnim. It's a Mishnah Masechet Eduyot, where Rabbi Eliezer says that when the builders were building during the Second Temple times, when they were building the sanctuary, the Hechal, the indoor part, they would put curtains, these temporary curtains, while they were building. And they also made temporary curtains around the courtyard. The only difference was that when it came to the Hechal, they would build outside of the curtains. So the curtains were delineating where the area of the Hechal would be, the indoor area, but it wasn't proper for the builders to build from the inside, because then they'd be standing inside the Hechal, and they shouldn't be. So they put the curtain on the inside, where the wall, the inner part of the interior of the wall, and they built around it. Whereas when it came to the courtyard, that's okay for the builders to be standing in the courtyard, and so they put the curtains around at the edge of the exterior wall, and they built within the curtains. It sounds from here that Rabbi Eliezer thinks that we need these curtains so that they could start sacrificing. So you need this physical delineation in order to offer sacrifices. And without any curtains, and certainly if the walls are destroyed, then you would not be able to offer sacrifices without either a wall or these curtains. That's the purpose that they put up the curtains, because it's going to take some time to build the walls. Amar Rabbi Yoshua, Shamati shehu makribin af al pi she'en bait, ve'ochlin kodesh kodashim af al pi she'en kelaim, kodashim kalim ma'aseh sheni af al pi she'en choma, mipnei shekedusha rishona kedusha l'sha'ata, ve'kedusha le'atid labo. Rabbi Yoshua says, and it seems that he is responding to and arguing with Rabbi Eliezer, he says, I heard a tradition that one can make sacrifices even though there's no physical structure. Even after the Beit Mikdash is destroyed, if you wanted to go to that spot, you need a mizbeach to sprinkle the blood and to burn the things on the mizbeach. That's true. So you do have to build a mizbeach somewhere up there, but you don't need physical walls. You could do the shechita, and you could do a sacrifice without a Beit Mikdash, and that you can eat kodesh kodashim, even though there's no curtains, but you have to know where the spot is, where the holiness of the kodesh is, where the courtyard would be, and then the Kohanim can offer kodesh kodashim and eat it within the space of the courtyard. And kodesh kodashim kalim, one maseh sheni, one can eat even though there's no wall of Jerusalem. These have to be in somewhere in the wall. So as long as you know where the wall used to be and you eat it within the walls, then that's okay. Why? Because the sanctification that was done originally when the Beit Mikdash was built was a sanctification for that time and forevermore. And therefore, it is independent of whether the Beit Mikdash structure is there or not. The space itself is holy, and so you don't need the structure. So certainly, the Rabbi Yoshua thinks that the holiness is forever, and that would fit with Rabbi Yochanan, who said if you do it outside of the temple courtyard area, then one would be liable. Because that is true forever. We said his reasoning right here. It's forever. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer does not say explicitly his reasoning that it's a temporary kedusha, but that's what it would seem. Since they're arguing with each other, and Rabbi Yoshua says it's permanent, sounds like Rabbi Eliezer would say it's temporary, and that would fit with Rish Lakish, who said that it's only for that time, but not permanent. So should we conclude that the machloket Tanaim is the same as machloket Amoraim? We say no. Lav mikilad Rabbi Eliezer Sabah lo kidesha. So shouldn't we conclude, as above, that Rabbi Eliezer thinks that it's temporary? So we say no, not necessarily. Amar le Ravina Rav Asher mimai dilma tkulama kedusha rishona kedusha lesha'ata v'kedusha le'atid labo. Ravina tells Rav Asher, how do you know? Maybe, in fact, everybody agrees, Rabbi Yoshua, and also that the consecration at the beginning was for that time and also for the future. And actually, they're not arguing with each other, not even in conversation with each other. This is in Masechet Eduyot, which is a collection of traditions that people had. And so the Rabbi Eliezer is saying, I heard a tradition about the curtains. That's it. And Rabbi Yoshua says, I heard a tradition that you don't need a structure, you can offer things anytime. But these are independent statements, and in fact, they would agree with each other. And if you ask, according to Rabbi Eliezer, why do you need the curtains? If the space itself is holy, and we just saw that according to Rabbi Yoshua, you don't even need curtains, you don't even need walls, you could offer sacrifices without anything. So if Rabbi Eliezer agrees with Rabbi Yoshua, then you have to wonder, then why did they make curtains? And the answer is, l'sidiyuta be'alma. That's just for privacy. It wouldn't be nice for people to be, everybody walking in and out, to be able to see right into the echal as they're building it. It's supposed to be an enclosed area, and so just for siniut, that's why they put the curtains. But in fact, without the curtains, the space itself is holy, and even after the curtains and the walls are down, one could still make sacrifices as long as you built a mizbeach up there. And in fact, while the Beit Mikdash, second Beit Mikdash before it was built, they already had a mizbeach and were offering sacrifices with the mizbeach without the Beit Mikdash yet being built. Itmar hama'aleh ve'en bo kezait ve'esem mashimo lekezait. Rabbi Yochanan amar chayav Resh Lakish amar patur. Now another machloket between these same two Amoraim. If someone offers outside of the courtyard a piece of a sacrifice, but there's no kezait. If there's no kezait, then you're not going to be liable to karet. However, let's say there's not a kezait of flesh, but it is attached to a bone. And if you count the flesh plus the bone, then it's for a kezait altogether. Rabbi Yochanan says he is liable. Resh Lakish says, no, we count only the flesh, not the bone, and he is not liable. But this all has to be accorded. We saw earlier the opinion that said that one is liable only if you sacrifice the entire animal, but not part of it. That was the opinion of Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Akiva disagreed in some case, and we're going to see later on that others say it's not the whole animal, but a whole limb. And so this would be according to one of the opinions that says even if you don't sacrifice the entire animal, one is still liable, but you certainly need at least a kezait. And how do you count a kezait? Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Chayav, Chibure Olin, Keolin Dameh. Rabbi Yochanan says one is liable because something that's attached to flesh and therefore needs to be put on the fire. A bone, if a bone is by itself, you don't have to burn it even for a korban olah. You could just leave it on the side and actually you could use it. But if the bone is attached to flesh, then you do have to burn it. So if something is attached to flesh, like a bone, and it goes up, so then it's counted as part of the flesh, and it counts towards the kezait. Whereas Resh Lakish amar patur, chibure olin, lav keolin damu. Resh Lakish said that things that are attached to flesh, although yes, the bone has to be burnt because it's attached to flesh, but it doesn't count towards the kezait. Ba'e Rava, hama'ale rosh ben Yonah she'en bo kezait, umelach mashimo lekezait mahu. Rava asks about a similar case. If someone offers outside of the temple the head of a pigeon, and that head by itself is not a kezait, it's very small. But you have to add salt. You always add salt to every sacrifice, and you add enough salt that actually puts it over the edge, and now it's a kezait. What do you say about that? Do you count the head by itself because the salt is not part of the head, or do you put it all together and now it is a kezait, and so he is liable? Amar leRava me par zakia leRava she lav hainu peluktayu d'Rabbi Yochanan v'Resh Lakish. And so Rava from Par Zakia Es Rav Asher, isn't this the parallel machlok between Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish? Rabbi Yochanan would say, yes, he's liable. Anything that's going up, you count as one. And so is it kezait, and Rabbi Resh Lakish says, no, only the flesh, and not the other things that are attached to it. So he's not liable. So we answer no. Tibai Rabbi Yochanan, Tibai Resh Lakish. In fact, Rava's question is applicable both according to Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish in the following way. Tibai Rabbi Yochanan, Ad kan lo kamar Rabbi Yochanan hatam ela aisim deminad de basarhu. You could ask according to Rabbi Yochanan, in the case of the bone with the flesh, that's what Rabbi Yochanan said he is liable because the bone and the flesh are one mean, they're one type. They're originally part of the same animal and they're originally attached. But salt is not of the same kind as the ben yonah. It's an independent thing that you're adding in from elsewhere. So even Rabbi Yochanan might say that we do not count the salt to make up a kezait. Or maybe he would, so we don't know. It's an appropriate question for Rabbi Yochanan. Tiba el Resh Lakish, ad kan la ka'amar Resh Lakish hatam ela, ti'i parish mina, lab mitzvah la sukeh. Aval hacha, ti'i parish mitzvah la sukeh, la, or dirma la shena. And we can ask the same question according to Resh Lakish. When does Resh Lakish say that you count the flesh only and not the bone? No, he only says that you don't count the bone because if the bone would be separated, you would not have to burn the bone. So you see, the bone is inherently not something that you have to burn. You just happen to burn it because it's attached to the flesh, but you wouldn't burn it otherwise. So that's why he does not count the bone towards the kezait. However, when it comes to salt, let's say the salt falls off the pigeon. The salt now becomes part of the sacrifice, and you still have to burn the salt. So you see, the salt independently has to be burnt. Therefore, it does count towards the kezait. Would he say that? Or maybe he would say, no, it's not part of the flesh, only the flesh and nothing else. So it's appropriate to ask this question also according to Resh Lakish. Either way, teko, we do not provide an answer. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.